La patologia
Endocrine disease is extremely important in PRM. I am particularly pleased to be able to go through this lesson of the e-learning course because we can explore more about this disease and see how our drugs can really make a therapeutic difference.
della cura.
In particular, we shall see how both hormones and cytokines in diluted forms can be combined for endocrine diseases since, in reality, there is a very important link between cytokines and hormones, and each one affects the other.
Le citochine.
For example, the female sex hormones stimulate Th1 polarity, i.e., the Th1 cytokines, and inhibit the Th2 cytokines, and cortisol also inhibits Th1 cytokines, and so on. This aspect of the link that exists between immunology and cytokines, as well as endocrinology and hormones, is therefore extremely interesting. Let us now look at the most important endocrine glands one at a time. In particular, the first one we will address is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is an extremely important gland. It is a large gland situated at the front of the neck and has a very important role in development and growth in the first part of life, i.e., if the thyroid does not function. Just today in my medical office, I saw a patient with a marked hypodevelopment of the thyroid, and the typical aspect of thyroid patients is precisely hypodevelopment. There is extremely reduced statural growth. It is of fundamental importance that the thyroid functions correctly, because the interaction between the thyroid and the pituitary gland results in the harmonic growth of our body. In subsequent parts of our life, however, the thyroid is very important for producing energy, burning waste, and cleaning the arteries. And we even see how hyperfunctioning, not normal functioning, but hyperfunctioning, of the thyroid is usually a guarantee of a longer life. So it is important that we pay the utmost attention to thyroid efficiency, especially in a world such as the present one, in which the frequency of autoimmune thyroiditis very often leads to thyroid hypofunctioning, which can in turn cause 1,000 evils and 1,000 metabolic problems, starting with hypercholesterolemia and ending with cardiovascular diseases and so on. We can say that the care and activation of the thyroid gland slightly in the hyper direction is therefore extremely important. For physiological regulating medicine doctors such as ourselves, it is important from a diagnostic point of view to study disease from a physiopathological viewpoint, and I would say to study it almost manically in order to be able to understand the clinical situation. In the case of thyroid diseases, it is extremely important to access not only TSH, though in conventional medicine we often see that only TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, is evaluated, and that action is taken to cure the thyroid only when TSH is increased, i.e., when the thyroid is not working well.
Stimolante della tiroide, e si interviene per curare la tiroide solo quando il TSH è aumentato.
I would say that it is important that we evaluate all the thyroid hormones, not only TSH. We therefore need to evaluate T4, which is a hormone that the thyroid produces initially. And although it is inactive, it still has a very important role because the T4 level influence the secretion of somatropic hormone by the pituitary gland, and the possibility of harmonic growth is therefore part of the role played by T4, though T4 is also very important for the transformation of fat into muscle tissue, and it is also involved in the formation of bone tissue. It is therefore extremely important to have good T4 levels. At a peripheral level, T4 produced by the thyroid is transformed into T3, especially in the liver, and thanks to the intervention of other hormones, including, for example, progesterone. T3 is the active thyroid hormone the one that effectively works as a metabolism-stimulating hormone. It is therefore certainly important to assess TSH. If it is low, it means that the thyroid is working too much. If it is high, it means that it is not working enough. It is important to assess T4, the inactive hormone, and it is also important to evaluate T3. We therefore first evaluate all of these hormones, and we may then possibly go on to supplement the lacking hormone. For example, if we have an obese subject, we will predominantly stimulate T4. If instead we have a non-obese and hypothyroidic subject, we will predominantly stimulate T3. So, what will the PRM therapy for hypothyroidism be? The PRM therapy for hypothyroidism has Gunamale as its basic drug in men and Gunafem in women, as it is important to act on the entire endocrine network. We know that Gunamale and Gunafem are restructurers and regulators of all the endocrine glands, starting from the hypothalamus, passing to the thyroid and arriving at the pancreas and testicles, etc. The basic drug for endocrine restructurization will therefore always be Gunamale or Gunafem. 20 drops in the morning and evening. In addition, if the subject is obese and hypothyroidic, we will add Guna T4, 6x, 20 drops in the morning and evening to stimulate not only thyroid function, but also the function of the somatotropic hormone which, as noted, is stimulated by T4. If, on the other hand, we have a hyperglycemic subject who is not necessarily obese, but who presents a hyperglycemia problem, it will be preferable to work with T3, because in hyperglycemia subjects we do not want to stimulate somatotrophic hormone, which in turn induces hyperglycemia. Naturally, we could also simply work by looking at their hormone levels. If we have a low level of T4, we would stimulate T4. If we have a low level of T3, we would stimulate T3. So, you can see how we work in a very selective manner. Another disease that we also observe rather frequently is hyperthyroidism. Also in autoimmune thyroiditis, there is often a hyperthyroidism phase before the thyroid exhaustion phase presents itself. Or there are times in which a frank hypothyroidism, Bézardow's disease, precisely the frank hyperthyroidism disease, presents itself. Which therapy should be imposed in hyperthyroidism? We will always need to work on the endocrine structure in its complexity in hyperthyroidism as well. Therefore, 20 drops of Gunamale in the morning and evening for men and 20 drops of Gunafem in the morning and evening for women. We can then, however, intervene in a specific manner, and we therefore see how it is very interesting to work with interleukin-1 in hyperthyroidism, especially in hyperthyroidism resulting from thyroiditis. Interleukin-1 is very important to hyperthyroidism if there is an inflammatory basis, and we can combine this interleukin with a hormone, somatostatin, which is the hormone that blocks every hormonal hyperproduction. We therefore work with somatostatin whenever we speak of hyper, whether it be hyperthyroidism or other. Therefore, 20 drops of somatostatin 4C in the morning and evening to modulate thyroid production. We also see how in the context of thyroid disease, which is a very complex disease that is very difficult to deal with, we can work very carefully with the general resetting drugs made available by PRM and with hormones and cytokines at a physiological low dose. If obese subjects, or generally overweight subjects, often need thyroid support, we have quite often seen and will see again that it is important to support the thyroid in these patients, as by supporting it, we antagonize some of their typical diseases. To the contrary, it is easy to observe that the typically low-limbed subjects, the underweight subjects, very often instead have a deficiency to other glandular structure, the adrenal gland. as there exists an equilibrium in our body in an immunological context between the Th1 and Th2 subsets, there also exists a kind of equilibrium in an endocrine context between adrenal function and thyroid function. Therefore, always, when one functions a lot, the other functions a little. So we have another balance in a certain sense, which is in an endocrinological context, and this balance is one of the thyroid and the adrenal gland. As I mentioned, some very well-known diseases exist for the adrenal gland, such as Addison's disease, which are diseases of adrenal fatigue. But at the same time, Addison's disease is a pathology, which is, contrary to hypothyroidism, extremely rare. There is instead, quite frequently observed not Addison's disease, but an adrenal deficiency, as if the adrenal gland were fatigued.
Un deficit surrenalico.
When does the adrenal gland become fatigued? The adrenal gland becomes fatigued during stress. A stressful life leads to fatigue of the adrenal gland. Aging leads to the fatigue of the adrenal gland, and the adrenal glands begin not to produce all of the various hormones any longer. The adrenal gland doesn't produce just a few hormones like the thyroid. Instead, it produces a large quantity of hormones in its three levels, the zona fasciculata and the zona glomerulosa and so on. It produces some very complex hormones. When the adrenal gland is fatigued, instead of producing aldosterone, androstenedione, and pregnenolone, and so on, it only produces cortisol. Adrenal fatigue expresses itself through the production of just one adrenal hormone. Or it also expresses itself with the interruption of cortisol production, so the subject begins to be tired, begins to lose weight, and begins to have a whole series of problems such as hypotension, and so on, until he may even end up dying. It is therefore important to understand when there is an adrenal insufficiency, and what should we do in this case? Also, in adrenal fatigue, we should immediately think of a basis of guna male or guna femme, to be used according to whether we find ourselves faced with a male or female subject, using, as always, 20 drops in the morning and evening to tone up the entire endocrine network. Guna matrix, for example, is also very important. In fact, it contains a very important corticoadrenal hormone, dihydroepiandrosterone, DHEA, which is at the start of the biosynthesis of various corticoadrenal hormones, and is very important in the tendency towards adrenal insufficiency, especially correlated with stress. We should also not forget that in PRM we have an extremely interesting hormone, ACTH, i.e., by using a physiological low doses of ACTH, we can stimulate the adrenal gland. Therefore, at a time in which there is a tendency towards adrenal fatigue, which expresses itself with hypotension, tiredness, weight loss, and so on, we take into account ACTH6X, which is also a very interesting drug because it activates many mental functions. For example, it is a greater activator of memory. Asthenic subjects often lose memory, interests, and so on. Further, we have seen that interleukin-6, though suppressive to the thyroid, is stimulating to the corticoadrenal gland. Therefore, in corticoadrenal fatigue characterized by, as mentioned earlier, hypotension, we should use interleukin-6 4C, 20 drops in the morning and evening. You can thus see that there is never anything that is absolutely negative. Interleukin-6, which is often accused of being a negative interleukin in certain subjects, is extremely useful in subjects that present a corticoadrenal deficiency. At other times, we instead see corticoadrenal hyperfunction. There is no need to see Cushing's syndrome, which is the typical syndrome of corticoadrenal hyperfunction. Sometimes we see a hyperfunction relative to the corticoadrenal gland. What should we do in these cases? As we said earlier, there is an equilibrium between the thyroid and adrenal glands. And when there is corticoadrenal hyperfunction, we must re-stimulate the thyroid to restore the equilibrium. TSH 6X, 20 drops in the morning and evening, is therefore important when there is adrenal hyperfunction. Melatonin, guna melatonin 4C, is also very important in adrenal hyperfunction because it will re-equilibrate this metabolic alteration.
Questa alterazione metabolica.
Naturally, in this case as well, we will always guna fem or guna male, according to the subject, for restructuralization of the endocrine axis, and still with the concept that if the adrenal gland functions a lot, the thyroid will be stimulated. We will not use guna matrix, which we have found to be useful in adrenal hypofunction, but we will use guna lympho, which better stimulates thyroid function.
Useremo il guna linfo che stimola maggiormente.
You will therefore see how adrenal disease, which is an erroneously underestimated pathology, can also be coped with very well with physiological regulating medicine. Today, everyone thinks that hyperthyroidism, everyone takes Euthyrox, and no one thinks about the hypocortisolism that leads to devastating effects on bone structures, memory, brain, muscles, and so on. And these must be considered as consequences of prolonged stress.
Del cervello, dei muscoli e così via, e che deve essere considerata perché è molto spesso la conseguenza dello stress prolungato.
It is extremely important in an endocrinological context to evaluate pituitary function. Clearly, the pituitary secretes an entire series of hormones that we cannot address here, at least in this point of the course. But I would like to focus attention on one of the pituitary hormones that seems very interesting to me, and that hormone is prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone of the growth hormone family, or, in an evolutionary context, it is a differentiation, in a certain sense, of somatrophic hormone.
Una differenziazione in un certo senso dell'ormone somatotico.
Somatrophic hormone is also present in reptiles, as it is in all animals. Prolactin is the hormone specific to mammals, and therefore the evolutionary step from reptile to mammal saw this mutation of the somatrophic hormone into prolactin. Prolactin is, therefore, a very important hormone to assess because, like all of the growth hormones, it must be investigated very carefully. For example, it can be very useful when mammary secretion needs to be stimulated. We know that prolactin, together with progesterone, for example, stimulates lactation, and therefore in a case in which there is a hypolactation, it is very important to combine prolactin 6X, 20 drops of prolactin, with 20 drops of progesterone 6X. This is an important stimulus of milk production.
20 gocce di progesterone in bassa diluizione. Questo è uno stimolo.
However, prolactin has many other effects. It regulates the electrolytic balance of the body, regulates the growth not only of the mammary structures, but also the growth of the entire body, influences the metabolism, influences immune function, influences reproduction, and also influences behavior. Prolactin is, therefore, a very important hormone that also acts on our nervous system. We can thus have a wide range of situations in which it is useful to act with prolactin. We administer prolactin when we want to increase body mass, for example, as if we were acting with another very particular growth hormone, and it also stimulates the proliferation of neurological cells, of the cells of the nervous system, and it can therefore also be useful, for example, in multiple sclerosis. In short, it is extremely interesting.
Neurologiche del cellule del sistema nervoso, quindi può essere utile per esempio anche nella sclerosi multipla.
Therefore, prolactin 6X has a growth hormone, tropic hormone of the mucosa, of muscle tissue, bone tissues, and so on. But what we also very often see is the need to limit prolactin levels. There are a whole series of pathologies in which we find elevated prolactin levels, which can be due both to the fact that there is a hyperfunctioning of the pituitary gland, which is only producing prolactin, Therefore, when the pituitary gland is in difficulty, it only produces prolactin.
Che c'è una distruzione dell'ipofisi che si mette a
Elevated
produrre.
prolactin levels can also be due to some physiological events. For example, continuous stressogenic stimulation leads to a hyperproduction of prolactin.
Una continua stimolazione
There's an
stressogena
entire range of cancers, but in particular, prostate cancer and breast cancer are largely dependent on the hyperexpression of the hormone. In these cases, it is therefore necessary to do everything to block the hyperproduction of prolactin. We very often see that in subjects with mammary neoplasia, it is the hyperexpression of prolactin that determines the progression of the neoplasia.
appunto nei soggetti con neoplasia mammaria è proprio la
Prolactin therefore has a central, very important role. What can we do for prolactin? We have, as I mentioned earlier, various situations that stimulate its production. Stress, for example, thyroid hormones, an increase in TSH, which occurs when the thyroid is hypofunctioning and tends to hypofunction, and in these cases stimulates the production of prolactin. Or the estrogens themselves stimulate the production of prolactin, and therefore we have that extremely dangerous combination that is the elevated level of estrogens and prolactin that, by both acting on the breast, if there is a mammary carcinoma or the tendency towards a mammary carcinoma, provoke a true deterioration of the clinical stimulation.
che agendo entrambi a livello del seno, se c'è un carcinoma mammario
Prolactin must therefore be inhibited in all of these circumstances. How can we inhibit it? We use both melatonin, 4C, and somatostatin, 6X, 10 to 20 drops of both morning and evening as inhibitors of prolactin.
la prolactina alla 30ª decimale, 10 gocce.
Their combination is very good in prostate cancer, breast cancer, and amenorrhea.
Carcinoma mammario,
Another case in which prolactin is high, increasing prolactin blocks ovarian function. So high prolactin is very often tied to infertility. All situations in which we have to lower prolactin levels.
useremo un'altra divisione di questo ormone.
There are, however, some situations in which we have to increase prolactin levels. What are they? When, for example, we want to increase mental focus in a subject, for example, we can have a subject in which we want to stimulate concentration or in which we want to stimulate growth. So in these cases we use prolactin 6X.
La concentrazione, in cui vogliamo stimolare l'accrescimento, la stimoliamo
It has been seen that longevity is closely tied to the function of the endocrine glands. And there are particularly two hormones that are correlated with longevity. One of these hormones is melatonin.
Teniamo conto tuttavia che si è visto che
Therefore, if we want to perform an anti-aging PRM therapy, we should administer 20 drops of melatonin 4C in the evening, which will, in a certain sense, invigorate the immune system, invigorate the cells, and in the end, lead to a more prolonged survival. The other hormone that prolongs survival is insulin-like growth factor 1, 6X. It has been seen that this hormone, which is also a growth hormone correlated with prolactin, leads to the prolongation of the life of an individual because it has a trophic edge on the cells. The cell, therefore, dies later, lives longer.
L'insulin-like growing factor 1. Si è visto che questo ormone, che anche questo è un ormone della crescita correlato alla prolattina, porta a
On the other hand, there also exist some hormones that, if too high, oppose longevity. Among these hormones we cite TSH. So what does this mean? It means that in order to live a long time, we must stimulate T3 and T4 in order to inhibit TSH. If we want to block this growth hormone, which causes one to live less, if it is high, we have to use T3.
è alto, si vive meno, quindi se vogliamo bloccare l'ormone della crescita dobbiamo
Prolactin is also a hormone that, if elevated, leads to a shorter life. Thus, very often we have to use some hormones that block prolactin levels. And here we have somatostatin 6X and melatonin 4C, and T3 once again that blocks prolactin, also somatotropic hormone, somatostatin and dopamine. We should therefore understand whether to stimulate or inhibit prolactin levels according to the case.
O se inibire I livelli di prolattina.
Organic metabolism is an extremely important and delicate mechanism that is fundamental for our health. It is also fundamental for the functioning of our immune system. Therefore, on one hand, a deficit and immune damage can manifest if a subject is malnourished, while on the other hand, when a subject is too well nourished, we also have immune damage. The equilibrium of nutrition, therefore, means equilibrium of the metabolism, and equilibrium of the metabolism also means equilibrium of the immune system. In today's Western world, we do not often see an immune deficit correlated with a nutrition deficit. We see it in anorexia nervosa, but much more frequently than anorexia nervosa, we see metabolic syndrome, which is tied to overeating. This metabolic syndrome is characterized by some parameters, i.e., for it to be referred to as metabolic syndrome, there must be at least 3 of these 5 elements. Obesity, especially abdominal obesity, and therefore an increase in visceral fat, increase in blood pressure, increase in triglycerides, decrease in HDL cholesterol, and insulin resistance at a cellular level. If at least 3 of these factors are present, we can refer to it as metabolic syndrome, which is a very complex pathology that opens the door to a great deal of serious tissue damage. This metabolic syndrome does not occur, as we may think, only in subjects that are 40 to 50 years old, even if its incidence naturally increases in subjects after the age of 50. But it is also seen in children. At least 1 out of 3 children, especially girls, are today in Italy obese, and they are children that are then destined to present with metabolic syndrome as adults. If the child is obese, that beautiful chubby child, very often it is a beautiful child, but it is a child that will then manifest type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis, infraction, and so on as an adult. All diseases that are correlated with metabolic syndrome. There are many factors in the pathogenesis of metabolic syndrome. It can be tied to obesity per se, because the fat tissue is not inert tissue. Adipose cells are real endocrine glands, and we can say that the adipose cells produce in particular interleukin-6. And this interleukin-6 is then the cause, that is, one of the causes of metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome can therefore originate from obesity, from overeating, and it can also originate from autoimmunity, as there can be an autoimmune factor that destroys and alters cellular structures, and can therefore favor metabolic syndrome that is therefore not always associated with obesity.
L'autoimmunità può esserci un fattore autoimmune che distrugge che altera le strutture cellulari e quindi può favorire.
There can be a familiarity to the metabolic syndrome. There can be a poor diet at the base of the metabolic syndrome. There can be a deficiency of some elements. It has been seen that a diet low in chromium, for example, very often leads to a greater incidence of metabolic syndrome.
Porta molto spesso a una maggiore incidenza di sindrome.
What is important to understand is that metabolic syndrome is actually the cause, the origin, the primum movens of many diseases. And we can therefore say that if we can represent metabolic syndrome with a sort of large X, and in this large X we put visceral obesity, dyslipidemia, and so on here in this phase, and on the other hand, in relation with this we will find hypertension and hypertension will then cause renal damage that is reflected in microalbuminuria. Therefore, we see this direct link between obesity and hypertension and renal damage.
Che si riflette in una microalbuminuria.
Hyperinsulemia will be correlated to insulin resistance, and the cells do not therefore respond to insulin. So these cause a hyperproduction of insulin. The hyperproduction of insulin determines that a great quantity of sugar is converted into fat and tissue, and this, therefore, creates a vicious cycle that then leads back to hypertension and so on, which is metabolic syndrome. It is therefore a vicious cycle that must be broken, a vicious cycle in which the hormones also enter. So we have just now seen that hyperinsulinemia is one of the important causes of metabolic syndrome, and also the growth hormones. Therefore, not only insulin, but also growth hormone GH, and even the glucocorticoids are connected to metabolic syndrome.
E anche gli ormoni della crescita.
So we can work very well from a therapeutic point of view with physiological low-dose hormones. For example, we know that if we administer DHEA in metabolic syndrome, or if we give Guna Matrix, which contains DHEA, we counteract metabolic syndrome at the true basis of its problems. And if we administer somatostatin 6X, we counteract the growth hormone that is one of the causes of metabolic syndrome. Therefore, you can see that there are some very important therapeutic insights. Interleukins, interleukin 6, interleukin 1, and tumor necrosis factor are produced in abundance in adipose tissue and are the cause of the metabolic syndrome itself, as well as organ and vascular damage correlated with metabolic syndrome.
Metabolica stessa e anche dei danni organici e vascolari correlati alla sindrome metabolica.
So what can we do? We can use those interleukins that counteract these pathogenic interleukins. Among these, for example, anti-interleukin 1 4C, interleukin 4 4C, and interleukin 10 4C are all interleukins that can block these effector interleukins at a vascular level in the tissue in metabolic syndrome. Naturally, the discussion here is very complex. From metabolic syndrome, one arrives not only at the vascular problems, but one also arrives at cancer, because metabolic syndrome means production of those interleukins, including, in fact, interleukin 6, which are the interleukins that have an effect on neoangiogenesis. Therefore, if there is a tumor in a subject with metabolic syndrome, this tumor will tend to progress. And therefore, the anti-cancer substances, which are, for example, somatostatin, T3, melatonin, should be broadly used in metabolic syndrome. It is therefore an extremely complex disease that cannot be confronted with diet alone. In fact, we very often see subjects that do a diet, 2 diets, 50 diets, and then get fat again. In metabolic syndrome, the problem is a hormonal problem and immunological problem, and then, secondarily, there's a dietetic problem. It is obvious that there is a dietetic problem, but if we do not resolve the hormonal problem with the therapy that acts on the physiopathological causes of the syndrome, we will not get anywhere. So what should we do in metabolic syndrome? In summary, and in conclusion, we have a great anti-fat drug that is Omeo Formula 1. One injection of Omeo Formula 1 once a week. We have a great drug that counteracts hyperglycemia, because metabolic syndrome is counteracted with a protein diet. Therefore, also with the assumption of SON formula, 3 tablets with each meal. We have Guna Matrix, which, as we have said earlier, counteracts hyperinsulinemia and hypercortisolemia. Therefore, 20 drops twice a day of Guna Matrix, a great metabolic syndrome drug. Then, naturally, Guna Fem or Guna Male, as regulators of the entire endocrine cascade, are extremely important. 20 drops in the morning and evening for metabolic syndrome. But let's not forget Guna T4 6X as a somatrophic hormone antagonizer. Therefore, 20 drops of Guna T4 6X as a somatrophic hormone antagonizer is very important. These drugs thus allow us, together with diet, to confront this disease, this clinical condition that is today not only the cause of heart attacks and atherosclerosis, but also the progression of many cancers.
Patologie tumorali.